With this video, we leave Greece and move west to the Italian peninsula, uh, um, and to eventually get to the Romans. But before we get to the Romans, it's important that we talk about the Etruscans, who were peoples that lived in Italy, but as we'll see, had a lot of contact with the ancient Greeks, and also would have a big impact on the subsequent Roman civilization. This requires us to talk a little bit about history first before we get into some of their artwork so you can fully understand what had happened. Now, in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, many of the Greek cities became overly populated, and the Greeks sent out many colonies. I haven't talked to you about this yet because I was saving it for this lecture. But we only talk primarily about the Greek world. But as we can see, the overpopulation of Greek cities caused them to go out to many places in the Mediterranean, almost all around the edges of the Black Sea and the southern Turkey. We see even on the north coast of Africa, near Egypt, all the way over to Spain and southern France. The city of Marseille in France was, in fact, first a Greek colony, and Greek finds are there. But the part we want to look at is other colonizations of the southern Italy and Sicily, the boot of Italy and Sicily, what was called Magna Graecia. Um, you can see the Magna Graecia in the legend there, and you can see here that this map breaks them down by their dialects, but their dialects also are regional. So, for example, the Doric color would represent more of Athenians and that region of Greece, Attica, who sent out colonies. The Ionic would be the west coast of Turkey. Achaean would be the Peloponnese and Sparta and northwest Greece, Epirus, etc. It's not you don't have to know all of these, but I just want to show you that they were all these various cities were sending out colonies because they were becoming overcrowded. And as I show you the upper left there is one of the many Greek temples that are found in southern Italy, in Magna Graecia, and we've talked about that with Pestum. At the same time, there are these people called the Etruscans living in Etruria, uh, just north of Rome and the Tiber. Rome is on the Tiber, so this portion is known as Etruria, where the Etruscans live. The Romans are Latins who live in Latium, once we get the Latin alphabet, which the Etruscans had a lot of impact on, which I'll show you shortly. Here we see the Greek alphabet in the middle. The Etruscans would adopt the Greek alphabet, but then change it to their needs, as we see in the top line. And they would eventually hand that alphabet over to the Romans, who would make it closer to their language, to their needs, and that would be the Latin alphabet, and that is the alphabet that we use to this very day. So it's because of the Etruscans that we have the alphabet that we have. Now, strangely enough, Etruscan has not been deciphered. We can make out several words in it. So, for example, we could make out that orator's name and that it was a dedication, but there are many other words that we can't make out, ones that do not refer to names or to gods that we know. And we can also see on these examples, it could be written from right to left, or left to right, if you like. One of the reasons it's thought that it hasn't been deciphered yet, even though it's most likely very close to Latin, is because we don't have many large entries. We just have these short inscriptions. But what's interesting is not too long ago, maybe about 15, 20 years ago, A mummy in Zagreb was finally unwrapped. Interestingly enough, this happens. What's happened in Zagreb happens a lot. Is that this mummy was bought over 100 years ago, but they never unwrapped it. They just kept it in this coffin and showed the coffin off, I guess, in the museum. It dates to the Etruscan period. It's a late Egyptian mummy, not from the classic period of the Bronze Age, but from much later. Um, and it was wrapped in a papyrus scroll that has this very extensive Etruscan inscription on it. Well, it's not an inscription, it's writing. And this must be the longest of all the Etruscan pieces of writing that we have. Here's another image of it, of how it's on display. Hopefully, perhaps this will give us an idea. This could help somebody with this decipherment. It's very curious because the language is so close to Latin, but we can't read it. It's very similar to the problems we have with linear A and linear B, where we can read linear B and we can see that linear A used the same glyphs or the same letters, but we can't read it. And that's the same with this. So that's an interesting aspect to the Etruscans. But keep in mind, the letters that we use in our writing basically come from them, who derive them from the Greeks. Now back to sculptures. Here's a very famous statue of the Etruscans called the Arezzo Chimera, or Chimera. A chimera is a beast of three different types. And in this case, and this is how it's most commonly shown, it's a lion with a goat growing out of its side and a snake or serpent as its tail. Once again, this sculpture, which is in the Florence Archaeological Museum, is a really impressive piece of artwork. I'd like you to notice once again, as we saw the lions in the Macedonian mosaic, that it's crouched down on its front paws and its hind area is lifted up, as in a stance of attack or fear. You've probably all noticed with your cats when they're scared, they crouch like this. And notice that the hair on its back and its mane are sticking up in what's called an artichoke design of hair. And then the skin is tightly around the skeleton, so you can see the rib cage and the pelvic areas and the hips, showing the bones. It's another thing that's interesting about a lot of Etruscan artwork. When they show the animals, they really show them as quite thin, as we'll see in another example after this. In any case, this chimera, its lion's front, is obviously in anguish and is roaring out. But then its tail comes out and bites the horn of the goat. And if you look closely at the goat's neck, you can see it's already been bitten and a little blood is coming out. Now let's go look at some details of this. Once again, we can see the mane of the angry lion standing up. But here we see the other angle of the snake grabbing onto the horn of the goat. And this it's a metaphor for inner turmoil, of inner strife, of not being comfortable with oneself. And it's just a very a spectacular way of visualizing this metaphor. Another important statue is the Capitoline wolf. Now, this sculpture has a very interesting history. Let me explain briefly first the history that was thought to be behind this statue, but what we now know. There is a foundation myth of the Romans, and it concerns Romulus and Remus. Perhaps several of you are familiar with this. Romulus and Remus were the mythological founders of the city of Rome. They were, but they were not born there. What happened is there was this. He had a grandfather. They had a grandfather by the name of Latinus, and his brother, the brother of King Latinus, was envious of him, so he usurped the throne from him. And when he usurped the throne from him, he also imprisoned Latinus's daughter, so she could not get pregnant and have children that would in turn take the power back from him. But while she's in jail, the god of war, Mars, the Roman equivalent of Greek Ares, spirits into the prison and sleeps with her and gets her pregnant. She bears two twins, Romulus and Remus, and then she puts them in a wicker basket and places them in the Tiber, just like the story of Moses, which is much earlier. And this story of placing these royalty into a river, into rivers and having them float down and just taking your chances is a common one for foundation myths of people that bring about new societies, as Moses would. So they go down the Tiber, and there they are found by a wolf, which raises them. It suckles Romulus and Remus, and it brings them to power. They go back. They throw out their nasty granduncle, put their grandfather back in power, but also they build the city of Rome, where they had been washed up and were raised by this wolf. They populate the city by freeing the prisons, and so their founding fathers are in fact criminals, and they would raid wedding parties as the centaurs would to get their founding mothers. So it's a very Roman myth. It shows how tough the Romans thought of themselves, their founders being raised by a wolf, and then they populate the city with these criminals because Romans are tough guys, and Ares, the god of war, is the father, etc., etc. So this wolf gets its name, the Capitoline wolf, because it was on one of the hills of Rome, the Capitoline Hill, and we have a wolf described for us by ancient sources, suckling Romulus and Remus. So we see this wolf here. Notice once again its body is very thin. It's just a bag of bones. The breasts of this mother are how should I put it, stretched, well used. She doesn't have as excited of a mane as our lion did, but she looks out at us in protection of her two sons here. So we had a written description of this, and then there's this wolf with these twins suckling at her breasts. What we've learned since then, we've learned more recently, however, is that these two little boys were inserted onto this statue in the Renaissance, and that the original statue did not have Romulus and Remus in them. It was just a wolf. But the Renaissance artists familiar with the ancient writings thought they thought that they went missing or something, and inserted these very corpulent Renaissance-looking little cupids to be at the breast of the animal. So this is an interesting Etruscan sculpture that has been adapted over time. What did it mean prior to having the two children in it? It's hard to know. But nevertheless, it has had a very Etruscan style of sort of no fat, very bony animals. Now, another thing that was found at an Etruscan site, and is a rare example of something from antiquity, is this bronze plaque that was used for auspices. That is to say, the reading of the future. It's called the person who did it was the Haruspex. the plural haruspices. But haruspices is also just a word to explain this idea. And what happened was when you sacrificed an animal, there was a priest there who would pull its liver out and stretch its liver out. You pull the liver out of the animal and stretch it and try to interpret what it meant based on the bumps on the liver or changes in color. And we can see here, this is a little diagram, this Etruscan one on the left is a little diagram teaching one how to read it. So if there's a mark here, it means this. If there's a mark here, there, it means that. The ones on the right are much older. These are Akkadian. These are from Mesopotamia. But they're all some of just a few examples of teaching implements for this practice. It's a pretty gruesome thing to think about because not only did these guys read the livers, they would read the entrails. So you have to imagine, there's a religious event where you're going to sacrifice the animal, and then you're going to spend after the rituals of sacrificing the animal, you'll cook it and eat it. But in between that, once it gets its neck cut, it would be what we called, what hunters called field dressing, which is to basically clean the animal, hang it up, cut open its stomach, get all the innards out. And there would be this priest who would just gorge his hands, elbow deep into these entrails and read various parts of it. But this little model is for the liver. The modern name we have for this practice is hepatoscopy. And it was taken quite seriously. We know of examples where there would be a sacrifice before a battle, and the haruspices were negative, and the generals wouldn't go into battle. There are many ways in which to predict the future. We talked about oracles already. They would do things like the flight of birds could tell them how to make, they would use the flight of birds as omens to predict what was going to happen in the future. But here we get from the Etruscans one of very few models that shows us specifically how it worked, but unfortunately we can't read the whole thing. Another really interesting aspect of the Etruscan world are their cemeteries. And this is the famous Cerveteri cemetery. And what they were these big dome-shaped rooms that are built, there are not just one, but there's many of them, as we see on the right, that go back into the distance. There's so many of them, as a matter of fact, an Italian archaeologist at one point decided that they didn't want to open up every one because it was so labor-intensive. So they would stick cameras down from the top and then photograph them to see if they were worth excavating or not. And I'm going to show you a couple right now of those wonderful Etruscan tombs. This is the very famous Tomb of the Shields and Chairs. You can see on the left-hand side, in the picture on the left, there's a chair on the right-hand side with a footstool. It is made out of stone. Obviously not a very comfortable chair. And then these bed-shaped structures around it. The circles on the walls were to replicate the shields that the Etruscans hung on their walls. These beds are interesting because they are. This room is really what's called a triclinium in Latin, which means it's an eating room. Because, as we'll see, the Etruscans dined laying on their sides while reclining. They thought it was unhealthy to sit and eat like we do. It was better to be laying down. And so these beds would be situated around a room, and this is how people would eat. Now, these are all made out of stone, so therefore not very comfortable. But nevertheless, it shows that the Etruscans did have a belief in the afterworld to the point that they needed a dining room, a place for them to eat. We'll see this concept of dining in the afterlife again in a sarcophagus I'll show you shortly. But it's a sort of fun idea that they thought of the afterlife as such a real place. Here's the one called the Tomb of Reliefs. And what we see here is a roof held up by two piers here, with variation sort of the Corinthian capitals. The decoration is completely unnecessary, and interestingly enough, would not have been seen by the public, just by the people buried in there. We can see at the back there is a little bed that has a stone pillow in it, where one would lay the body. So the body, even the dead person, had a place to sleep. Above, we see two shields, and then a helmet, as they would hang them off the walls. Below, underneath the bed, we see a relief sculpture of a chariot being led by a griffin, a mythological character, showing influence from the Near East. But then a whole bunch of other items that one would use in warfare or just in general in living. We can see on the left-hand pier, we can see axes and swords as they hang off the wall, a strigil, a pouring vessel. On the right, we see some other pieces of pottery hanging off the pier. I mean, it's not real pottery, nor are these real shields or anything. These are just carved in stone. But believing them by having the image, you also they would be real in the next life, and so it shows a definite and very corporeal, I should say, view of the next world. We also get this wonderful sarcophagus. This is called the Cerveteri sarcophagus. I'm going to show you this example, but also show you one that's on display in the Louvre, and because there are several of these, or at least two of them, but we'll look at this one first. First of all, it's a charming setting of a man and a woman reclining while eating, and his right hand over her right shoulder is probably holding a drinking vessel of some sort. And what she's doing is probably tearing apart some bread to hand to him, and his left hand holds out to receive it. And so it's a really charming and sweet sort of depiction here. The idea that in the afterlife, this couple would dine together, and a reflection of how they ate in real life. Notice that they recline on these pillows, and these pillows are on a nice cushion. Now, this is all made out of clay, of course, but that's probably how they really did it. But let's look at the faces and the hair of these two figures. And what we see is that they have a very archaic style to them. And indeed, as I said, these areas, southern Italy was occupied by various Greek colonies in the Archaic period. And we can see that the Etruscans were greatly influenced by them. There's a close-up shot on the right, showing you once again her probably tearing apart some bread and handing it to him. Notice that they have those almondine eyes, like as in the Archaic period. They both have the archaic smile, and then her bead-like hair comes down. On the left, we see the backside of it. His body doesn't make the transition very well from the torso to the hip. His legs are just a little bit too long here, but it makes it work on the front. As I said, there are other examples of these. This is not the same one I showed you before. This is a bit different. But we have the same general idea. And here's another shot of it. We can see that his beard is a bit different on this one. We also see the influence of Egyptians on this, in the sense that she is of white skin and he is of reddy brown skin. When the pillows that they recline on are a little bit different. Her hair is painted in this example, but the general posture is very much the same as what we saw in the last one. So this was a type of sarcophagus that Etruscans used. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you what sarcophagus is. A coffin, basically. It comes from the Greek to mean the flesh eater. Phago being eating, sarco means flesh. And we're going to see a lot of sarcophagi in the Roman period. And here we just get some shots of his boots here. It's a nice, delicate design, um, and the drapery on their clothing. And here we just see the end of it. It's on a piece of nice wood, this one here. I don't know if that's the original. Probably not. We probably just have the top lid of this one, and the bottom had to be redone. And here's the backside of it. Sorry for the reflections in the pictures, but I just wanted to show you that there are some other examples of this type. Notice, by the way, in this example, his legs are not too long. His feet stop short of his wife's feet, but that represents, more closely his form. Now, another fun sarcophagus is the Ramthavishni sarcophagus. This is up in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So the next time you're in Boston, you should take a look at it. It's two people reclining in bed, a man and a woman, and obviously they are about to engage in lovemaking. Notice that we see the top parts of their bodies, but then they're covered by a blanket that reveals their body, but not too much. It smooths out along their legs and then wrinkles both between them and on the sides to show their body. Interestingly enough, both of their feet come out from underneath the blanket, but I guess that didn't bother them. But it's a really touching coffin or sarcophagus for this couple. The idea that this is how they would be for the remainder of their lives is a charming aspect to the Etruscans. Now, one more coffin I want to show you, and it's called the Tomb of the Divers. We can see with the date 470 BC, this dates to the 5th century, not to the Archaic period like we saw with these other ones, but to the 5th century. And it is made of a series of limestone blocks, which I'll show you in a moment. Now, it's called the Tomb of the Divers because of this diving scene on the lid. It shows him diving into a pool of water with one tree there and a diving platform. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but I got to introduce one idea, a Greek idea, before we talk about this, and that's the idea of a symposium. Perhaps some of you read Plato's Symposium. A symposium was a drinking party. Posium, the word potable comes from posium. Sim means together. Now, how did this idea of getting drunk together become a symposium that we think of as a place to debate and discuss things? Well, it's because when they had these drinking parties, and as we see in Plato's Symposium, there had to be a theme of what they discussed. So in Plato's Symposium, they discussed the nature of love, and where did love come from, and why does it exist, etc. So they would have these themes. But there are also, they were parties. As we see in the black and white image on the upper right, they were frequented sometimes by prostitutes called hetaira. They were educated prostitutes who could also play musical instruments and recite poetry, dance, etc. And we see that shown quite vividly here in that red figure vase. A vase it's what's called a kylix, which we see on the lower left, the one in color, of this man about to climb out of bed, it seems, his left leg coming out, and he holds one vessel in each hand, this kylix. These very flat and broad drinking cups that are not very good for drinking, quite frankly. They're way too shallow and broad, and you'd have to hold them by both handles to drink from them. But they were that way for a different reason that I'll show you in a moment. And notice how he holds the kylix in his right hand. But before I get to that, I want to point out that in both of these vessels, the paintings you're seeing are on the bottom side of the very vessels that he's holding. And so they're showing what happens when they're at these drinking parties. And that vessel is part of a drinking game that I'll show you right now. And as you'll see, the oldest drinking game that we know of. Now, back to the tomb itself. Okay, we can see on the lid here this brown figure, so a male, diving off a platform into this blue water. So it's just, he liked to swim or something. But on the bottom, there are 4 plaques. Limestone plaques. We only see one here, with men reclining on their triclinia, on their dining beds, and there's one man on one on the left, 2 in the center, and 2 on the right. And those brown things in front of them are profile views of tables, because their food would have to be set down on a table in front of them. And the table on the right has 2 of these Kylix cups. Now, what's happening here? Well, the guy in the middle, with the brown blanket over him, is flicking a Kylix cup. And the man to his left has just finished doing the same thing. And they're playing a drinking game I'll explain in a moment. But I first got to draw your attention, obviously, to the men on the right who appear to be about to embrace. And once again, we've talked about the nature of homosexuality and bisexuality in the Greek world, and we see that being followed here. And indeed, these are paintings in the Greek style. But here we can see both sides with the men in the symposium. Once again, on the top left, the 2 guys on the left are playing this drinking game that I will show you in a moment, but this just gives you a nice parallel of each side of this tomb. And quite frankly, the nice blue that shows the blankets that were, or cushions perhaps, that were laid over these beds. Now, to the sides, on the left side, we see a young boy, and what he's doing is taking wine from the mixing bowl. Remember that the Greeks liked to mix their wine with water. And so it would be mixed in this mixing bowl, and then the boy would bring the wine to the men for them to drink. On the other side, as shown here on the bottom right, is a boy, or a woman actually, playing a double flute there, and 2 men dancing along behind her. And on the left, we see a close-up of the men playing this drinking game, where they flick this cup. Once again, I'll explain that in a moment. But I want to point out, we see the excellent painting of the 5th century, just as we saw in the red figure vases in Athens. The nice depiction of the laurel wreath that he has in his hair for the party. Notice how well the eyes are done, that they're now really shown from the side. They're not frontal eyes pasted on the side of the head. And the musculature and the short beard are also very well portrayed. Now, what happened in this game, in this drinking game, is that they drank from cups like this. And as I said, they're quite shallow. These are modern reproductions. But the way it operated was the following. They would, wine, has dregs in it. Our modern wine doesn't, because it's made by an industrial manner. But before you made wine, the traditional way of making wine was you put grapes into a big vat, and you got in there with your bare feet, and you stomped on the grapes until they pushed all the juice out of them, and then that grape juice you would then ferment to make wine, which you all know. In that process, however, some little pieces of the skin would get into the wine, and you don't see it that much anymore. Every once in a while, if you get some wines from traditional places, there'll be like a little bit of fine grainy sort of material on the bottom of the bottle. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, traditionally people would decant their wine, is so you would wait for those dregs to settle and then pour the wine off the top. But it would get into the bottom of their the bottom of their cups. And what they would then do is flick the cup at an object, or flick the dregs. After they drunk all the wine, the dregs would be on the bottom, and with this strange handle, they would flick the cup and see if these dregs would knock off a piece of metal or a pin from a stand. Now here's some students at Gettysburg, I believe, in Pennsylvania, who reconstructed this game. They took their pottery, and then they tried to play this game. And you can see, and we know this from Greek pottery, is that there were little stands that had pieces of metal precariously balanced on the stand, and the point of the game was to just knock it off with the dregs that you flicked from your kylix. Okay, it's not the smartest game in the world, but no drinking game is, quite frankly. It's just silliness. But they recreated it, and obviously it had to be somewhat had to have some practice in order to do it. And we see it here on these vessels, and the Greek word for it is kotavos, kotobos in ancient Greek. And you can see, for example, this Hatari, this woman on the right, playing that game. She's about to flick the kylix. Now, this is a fairly explicit red figure vase, which shows these, couples engaged in sexual activities. But what she's flicking it at, you can see her on the right there, holding it with her right hand, but looking away. Now go past the couple in the middle, and in between those two couples, in the middle and on the left, you'll see a little stand there. And that's where they would balance this little cup on a pin, basically. And that's what she's trying to hit, to knock it off. And as we see in the bottom of this drinking cup, which is also replicated, replicates the real thing, we see under the handle on the right, once again, a boy bringing wine to these couples, the attendants in them. So I guess these could be fairly shameless parties here, but it is what it is. Here's another example. Actually, not another example, this is the other side of it. Once again, we see a couple there on the left. In the middle, we see a boy playing a flute for a man who is drinking and holding his hand on his head in enjoyment of the music. And on the right, I guess, one of these beds being made. But it gives us a very close idea of how this worked. Or we see these other vessels. These will be on the interior of these drinking cups. And so as you drank your wine, you could see either this woman here on the left holding two cups, and she's flicking one and holding the other. Perhaps you got two tries at this game, because the guy on the right is doing the same thing. He holds one drinking cup while he's about to flick the dregs of the other. So we can see this was a common theme in Greek artwork or Greek pottery. And there are even variations of this game called plastinks or manes, or the oxybophon version of. I'm sorry, I misspoke. The plastinks and the manes are the objects themselves. You don't need to know those words. But there are variations on this game, like this crinkly pin on the left where they're balancing the pot on it. You can see the naked woman's doing that. And there's a naked woman to the right there, I believe, and she's holding a thyrsus, right, the stick you would hold when you would celebrate Bacchanalia, the festival in honor of Dionysus. We see the drinking, mixing vessel in between them, so where they'd mix the wine and the water, and then the person on the right, I can't really make out the gender, but the person on the right is holding the cup. And then a person on the left also holding a thyrsus, but obviously a man there, and holding some other stick as well. But there are variations on this game, and we can see once again on the right the same thing with this man reclining and this female reaching up to put this cup on the very top of a pin that they try to knock over. So we see this influence from the Greek worlds on the Etruscans. And in that wonderful Tomb of the Divers, we see this man who obviously enjoyed his symposia as well as obviously diving. And that tomb might be the only, I still think it's the only painted tomb with figures in it that we know from this early period. So it's a really exceptional tomb, and also it helps us share an idea of how these of how the Greeks lived and how they celebrated, quite frankly. Okay, next we'll pick up with the Roman Republic.